Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Hudson Institute, please be welcome to our conference on Nicaragua this afternoon. Latin America has advanced notably in leading dictatorial regimes back into democratic governments. Starting the 21st century, democracy was prevalent in the hemisphere, while military dictatorships had shrunk into oblivion, or so it was believed. Well, that was then. Today, democracies are still vigorous and prevalent. However, there remain a few open wounds that each day call for increased attention and action in the hemisphere. In particular, two countries, Nicaragua and Venezuela, are back to murdering and jailing their citizens. Caracas and Managua have become the killing fields of Latin America. How sad. In Nicaragua, for weeks, hundreds of young men have lost their lives in public demonstrations in Managua and other cities. They seek democracy, real democracy, not the dictatorial hammer of Daniel Ortega. We're fortunate to have with us three outstanding speakers to discuss with us the maladies of Nicaragua and the reaction of hemispheric organizations to the tragic picture of this nation. The first to speak will be one of the most prominent journalists and intellectuals in Latin America, my distinguished friend and old boss at La Nación, and former ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations, Don Eduardo Ulibarri. He will be followed by Professor Polga-Hecimovich. ¿Está bien? A professor of comparative politics at the U.S. Navy Academy. He's one of the most sought-after specialists to discuss his research on the effects of political institutions on democratic stability and policy making and governance in Latin America. Finally, we're very honored to have with us Victor Agustin Cuadras Andino, who is a Nicaraguan youth leader and activist who will speak of his experience in mobilizing protests against Daniel Ortega's regime. After the presentations, we will open a period of questions from the public. Our thanks to Sean Kelly, our Director of Public Activities at Hudson, for his very valuable assistance. He and his staff merit our appreciation. Also very important, I thank Dr. John Walters, Vice President of Hudson, for his backing and counsel. And without any further ado, we turn the microphone to Eduardo Ulibarri. And before he comes up here, this is in today's New York Times. It's seldom to have, except for tragedies of big magnitude, to get a full page of the New York Times in today's edition. Well, those are the good news, I guess. Don Eduardo.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jaime, for your kind words, and especially for your unconditional and long-lasting friendship. I have never been his boss, really. Just he was a contributor to the newspaper that I used to edit in Costa Rica, but that's a very distinguished contributor. I decided to prepare a set of 4 slides together with a couple of graphics about the situation in Nicaragua. in order to organize the 4 basic topics that I would like to cover. And well, I thank you, Jaime, and the Hudson Institute for the invitation, and you for being here. I'm sorry I didn't mention that before. I will try to refer first to the elements that contributed to the creation in Nicaragua of what I think it could be called an autocratic status quo that lasted in one way or another until the beginning of the mid-April of this year. Then I would like to refer to what happened in order to erosion that kind of status quo and create the turmoil that Nicaragua now faces and the repression that the regime has undertaken against its population. And that will be the 3rd topic. And finally, I would like to look a little bit into the future with all the risks that such an exercise includes in order to discuss a little bit what options there could be for the situation in Nicaragua. Well, if we ask ourselves, and of course, everything that I'm going to talk here is limited because for the sake of time. So I have had to be very selective. But what have been like the building blocks of the regime of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua back since 2006, when he first became elected, up to now. And he has been re-elected twice by different maneuverings. First, because of the decision of the Constitutional Court that allowed a continuous re-election, and they throughout an amendment of the Constitution. Well, there are certain blocks that have been very important in order to build, let's say, that wall of status quo with soft repression. First, there have been continuously a deliberate and successful effort either to pressure, control, outlaw, or co-opting different sectors of the Nicaraguan society. And that has worked especially with some political parties, with the private sector, and also at some time with the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Church, more so up to now. The combination of these elements have induced at the same time an increasing control of institutions in Nicaragua, with the complicity, for example, of the Liberal Constitutional Party, that is one of the traditional parties in Nicaragua, led by former President Arnoldo Alemán. Ortega was able to take control of the judiciary, the electoral tribunal, the comptroller's office, and all other major institutions in Nicaragua. At the same time, they started to weaken opposition parties to the extreme of outlawing some candidates in the previous 2016 election. With the church, the relations have been accidental. At some time, Cardinal Miguel Obando y Bravo was close to Ortega and his family, but now the church have taken a different turn and have become, as we'll see, one of the major sources, not exactly of opposition, but of independence and counterpoint to the government. And up to the rebellion that started on April 18th, the Evangelical Church was close to a great extent to Ortega, but that has been changed. So you have either control, co-option, regulation, or repression, depending on your attitudes of political parties, of the churches, at the same time of independent sectors, civil society, and a deliberate effort in order to take control of the news media in Nicaragua. Not throughout expropriation, but by buying media, using, in general, funds from Venezuela, and by harassing and controlling and trying to repress the independent media. So the major TV networks in Nicaragua are either owned or controlled by the Ortega family. We also have had election manipulation. It was really open and almost impossible to hide in the 2016 presidential and congressional elections. There have been, and this has been very, very important, a collusion between the government and the major business sectors in Nicaragua that lasted until April of this year. It was a very peculiar arrangement. It was a deinstitutionalized arrangement by which Ortega and the big business people of Nicaragua agreed about certain rules of procedures in Nicaragua. And we could say that Nicaragua was a very business-friendly country, but without institutions to give judicial certainty to that business friendship. But the business sector of Nicaragua and also some international investors that have invested in light manufacturing in Nicaragua have been, to some extent, enjoying a very good relation with Ortega up to this rebellion. And they have provided coverage to Ortega, and even they have been influential with international sectors in order to avoid the imposition earlier on of sanctions against some government officials in Nicaragua. Then we also had the massive inflows of Venezuelan subsidies. Those inflows didn't go through the national budget of Nicaragua, but through some public-private partnerships and corporations, basically controlled by the Ortega family and his cronies. And then there have been a very wise maneuvering with international sectors. For example, the Nicaraguan army has had very good relationships with the Southern Command of the US, which is based in Panama, especially for the interdiction of drug trafficking that has pleased the US government along the years. And also, they have had good relations up again to April 18th with the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, contrary to what has happened with Venezuela, where since the beginning of repression, the Secretary General of the OAS took a very strong position against the regime. And finally, using all this setup, and especially the Venezuelan subsidies, the government has been able to go into personal dealings, handouts, and clientelism with some sectors of Nicaraguan society. So I think these have been the key elements of the authoritarian statu quo or the soft repression of Nicaragua. And I would add to that there has been some reasonable economic growth in Nicaragua, an average of 5% in the whole Ortega period. And I would also say a very good management of macroeconomic policy. And we can say that the only real independent institution in Nicaragua up to a point now is the central bank. And it has remained as such until now. So the other thing that I would like to cover is what was happening in the meantime. Well, we had two elections, the 2016 presidential and congressional elections. We had the municipal elections of 2017, and the manipulation, the repression, the outlawing of independent candidates in both elections was so open that the very weak institutional and democratic legitimacy that the regime pretended to have weakened a lot due to those elections. There have been different calculations about what the degree of abstention in the Nicaraguan elections was. According to the Electoral Tribunal, which is controlled by Ortega, it was roughly about 35%. but some opposition groups say that it was between 65 and 70%. That was in 2016. Anyway, it was a massive abstention that what Nicaragua faced. Also, the downfall of Venezuela, of course, have eliminated the subsidies that affected public finances and the ability of the government to provide sources of clientelism, and also the public finances together with the weakening of the pension system of Venezuela presented a major defiance to the government. And I think that that created the first breakdown with the private sector, because the government wanted to impose new taxes, and the government decided to go ahead with a reform of the pension system, by the way, stimulated by the International Monetary Fund. That's one of the paradoxical things of all this. But they went ahead with that system without consultation with sectors of the population. All this started to exhaust the quid pro quo that Ortega and the business sector had established. And you have to add to that the massive corruption in Nicaragua, in which you need to live in order to make business to a certain extent. Also, due to repression, due to the lack of legitimacy of the elections, many sectors started to take a more oppositional approach to the regime. And I would say that among those sectors, probably the peasants, the organized peasant movement of Nicaragua, and students have been at the forefront. And one element that affected a lot the attitude of peasants was the so-called, the project of the so-called Gran Canal of Nicaragua that became a mirage in the 2013 and 2014. Nothing has happened in terms of construction, but what has happened is that a lot of land was expropriated by the state in order to give it to the supposed Chinese consortium that has been in charge of the canal. When the construction was inaugurated in 2014, and then it didn't go out, what the government said that by 2020, the canal would be operational, and that at least 3,500 vessels would pass every year through the canal, and that 350,000 people would leave poverty in Nicaragua. Nothing of that has happened. And of course, that has created a lot of frustration, especially among those people who have been expropriated of their land. Also, as we all know, the ideological and political balance of Latin America has changed. The ALBA group, led by Venezuela and Cuba, doesn't have any major influence right now. And the major countries of Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Peru. I am not going to include Costa Rica, but it's very important in that because of the tradition of Costa Rica, has been very active in opposing repression, and of course have political and ideological outlooks, very, very different from the ALBA countries, as well as Chile and even Uruguay, which is governed by a leftist coalition. I put in question marks whether the US has changed its attitude, because I am not so sure. Of course, the US is not happy with the Ortega regime, but has been happy with the behavior of the Nicaraguan army. And there are some business interests of the US that have had businesses in Nicaragua. And there are some sectors of the evangelical churches in the US that have very good relations with evangelical churches in Nicaragua that at the same time have had very good relations with the Ortega regime. So this gives us a signal on how able Ortega has been in managing relations internationally. It resembles, to a certain extent, the situation of Manuel Ortega in Panama in the late 80s. He was able to work with everybody, with the Cuban intelligence, with the CIA, with the Southern Command, with everybody, up to a point when it was unsustainable to keep that. But well, you had a US invasion at that time that is not possible anymore in Latin America. But well, on April 18th, the card castle fell in Nicaragua. And maybe it was not so much surprising that it fell, but the speed at which it has fallen. It's very, very difficult to comprehend, but it happened. My explanation is basically included in this slide. Well, first, the unconsulted negotiation and change and reform of the pension system that increased the age of pension, increased the contributions of the pensioners, and decreased the benefits. So everything was against the people who were in the pension system, and of course the businesses that had to contribute to it. Then, as you know, there were protests. There was a very undiscriminated repression against those protests that provoked a real civil rebellion that has ignited even more repression. According to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the last count that they have, there have been at least 317 people killed in Nicaragua. That's really surprising in so short a period of time in a country that has roughly 6.5 million population. It's really, really, really impressive. There was a total rupture with the business sector, up to now, at least. A civil opposition coalition was created by students, peasants, some political parties. The business sector was there. The Catholic Church tried to mediate a dialogue in order to look forward to a political solution. Most of the sectors there asked for early elections, which Ortega has rejected, and the dialogue was a failure. And as the repression increased, the Catholic Church, or at least part of the Catholic hierarchy of Nicaragua, has taken a very strong opposition position against the regime, as well as the Moravian Church, which in Nicaragua is very important along the Atlantic coast because of the Mosquito population, and the Evangelical Church that has changed in its attitude. The international political coverage of Ortega is now very weak. As you probably know, the OAS has taken two decisions regarding Nicaragua. One, it was on July 18th when the OAS condemned the repression against the population. And then on August 2nd, it established a working group of Latin American countries in order to look for a solution of Nicaragua, for the situation of Nicaragua. Then insecurity is a major concern, not only of the leaders and the activists of the protest, but of normal people and business sectors. And that have had, of course, a severe impact on the economy of Nicaragua. There have been more, I would say, earlier pressures against the Nicaraguan regime on the part of the international community than the pressure that was put on Venezuela at, let's say, more or less a certain moment like this in Venezuela. Latin America has taken a leading role, which is not common, but had not been common up to now. As I said, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the Organization of American States, the US to some extent, and the European Union. And there have been, as is inevitable, major sources of migration, which have especially been channeled up to now to Costa Rica. I'm going to show you a couple of things that I think it's important. According to FUNIDES, which is a think tank of the private sector, Fundación Nicaragüense de Desarrollo, Nicaraguan Development Foundation, they calculate that the loss of employment in Nicaragua up to now, well, that calculation was made on July 27th, adds to about 250,000 jobs out of a working population of roughly 3 million people. Of that population, according to the official data, which is really unbelievable, 3% is unemployed, 39%, but 42% is underemployed. So if you take into account 250,000 people out of a active population or working population of close to 3 million, you have roughly between 7 and 8% of jobs that have been lost up to July 27. And the trend continues. This is also an estimate made by FUNIDES. They have this this blue line, the GDP increase of Nicaragua in the last years, the initial projection for 2018, and two scenarios that they take into account. Was one of those assumes that there is some political way to leave this crisis. And in that sense, the economy will drop to minor 0.3%, increase or a decrease of 0.03%. And the other assumes that the political turmoil continues, and they estimate that there could be a plunge of close to 6% of GDP in Nicaragua this year. Being a Costa Rican, of course, migration is very important for us. We don't have a wall, and we don't intend to have a wall along the border with Nicaragua. But as you can see, this is the number of asylum requests that in Costa Rica since May 18 up to now. This is actual numbers of people to request asylum. There is a trick with this data. Not all of those that are requesting asylum in Costa Rica are newcomers. Some of them have been living in Costa Rica for some times, even maybe for years, and they are using the circumstances in order to get asylum. But not all the people that have entered Costa Rica ask for asylum. Most of them enter either illegally or they enter legally and they live with their families in Nicaragua. But it gives you a sense from just 87 in May of this year, we jumped to 3,344 in June and 4,241 in July. And if you want to look at it a different way, this blue bar, or the blue part of the bar, corresponds to requests of asylum by Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. The other bars are the yellow one is Venezuela, the green one is the north of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the other ones are Colombians and other nationalities. So after having almost no requests of political asylum by Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, we have jumped to a major number of requests in that sense. And I'm finishing, Jaime. Okay. Okay. So this is, like the crystal ball. What might happen? What might be the way out? Well, I am referring to 4 possible scenarios. The ideal one, very difficult to achieve, is that there are early elections under strong international supervision and after some institutional reform that guarantees that the elections will be fair and all political parties could compete in the elections. Ortega has rejected all that up to this point. And he has said that that will be the equivalent of a coup d'etat, and he has rejected that. Another possibility is that dialogue really starts. So far it hasn't started. That there is some institutional reform that creates confidence and de-escalates the protests and the turmoil in Nicaragua, and that there is a possibility to remain in that, soft kind of way out until the elections that are set for 2021, for 2021. The other will be a recreation of the previous status quo in different circumstances, co-opting the private sector, trying to convince the private sector that the option is Ortega or chaos, and trying to convince some international sectors of the same thing. And the fourth possibility that I think is outright dictatorship. So far, dictatorship in Nicaragua has been, like by installments, little by little, But now it's really an open situation of dictatorship, harsh repression, disregard for the international system. Whether you can keep that situation or not is very difficult to answer. If we look at Venezuela, you can at least say that it's possible to remain in that situation for many years. If you have the will, if you have the resources of repression, and if the international pressure is more political than economic. And so far that has been the case. Well, what are some of the leverages that could be used in one sense or the other? Well, the Catholic Church, of course, is important. All the churches, but the Catholic Church is the better organized, and of course, the massive religion in Nicaragua. Strong international pressure that goes beyond the political and goes into the trade and financial pressures against Nicaraguan regime. That's very unlikely, but it's possible. A total economic downfall of Nicaragua. I think that's unlikely also. The economy is shrinking. It has shrunk a lot, but poverty is nothing new in Nicaragua. Bad living conditions is nothing new in Nicaragua. So it's something that could be sustained for some time. The attitude of the business sectors, of course, is very important, and the organizational capacity of the opposition. That's another major issue. So far, the opposition in Nicaragua has been fragmented deliberately by the regime. There are not necessarily a lot of confidence among different sectors of the opposition, and that's a problem that we have to face. Well, that's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry if I went beyond the time, but thank you very much. Se me fue la mano.
No, perfecto.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Ambassador Dadenblum for the kind invitation to speak. Thank you to the Hudson Institute for hosting this great event. I'm a comparative political scientist, which means that I study the politics of countries, within countries, not necessarily the relationships among countries. And so that's going to be my focus today, is the internal dynamics of Nicaragua, Nicaraguan politics, and what has happened historically leading up to this moment, and then how that compares to things that we might be seeing around the region, specifically Venezuela, right, which the ambassador has already referred to, Ambassador Ulibarri. So comparative political scientists, I think probably our main focus of study is democracy and democratization. And Samuel P. Huntington proposed an idea called the third wave of democratization, which referred to the democratization of a great number of countries across predominantly Latin America, Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, and parts of Asia, after they decolonized in the 1960s and 1970s. And unfortunately, what political scientists today, over the past 2 or 3 years, what we are seeing is what some of us are calling the third reverse wave of democracy. We've seen a lot about this in the press so far, in countries throughout the world, including the United States, where people's attitudes, the public attitudes towards democracy, is maybe more indifferent than we've seen in the past, which is really distressing kind of development. We've also seen in countries, especially in more weakly consolidated democracies, we have seen governments take advantage of this to push authoritarian agendas, right? Political systems, when this happens, move from, if you're a democracy, a strongly consolidated democracy, you move from being a strongly consolidated democracy to what we call a hybrid regime, right? Or what Steve Levitsky calls a competitive authoritarian regime. Essentially, it's an electoral democracy, but it's like playing, a basketball game where the other team has 10 players and you have 2, and they bought the refs too. Okay, so yeah, you can compete, but it's not really free and fair. And then at the other extreme, we have outright dictatorship, where there's full-scale repression of the population. And I'm going to start on a positive note after saying all of that. And the positive note with Nicaragua, and with Victor here today, is that the Nicaraguan, Daniel Ortega, and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua have done exactly what governments throughout the world, in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Hungary, in Poland, have attempted or are currently doing, which is he has taken the country from a hybrid regime to dictatorship, right? That's the negative. The positive, though, is that the student-led protest movement and the entire Alianza Cívica fighting this in Nicaragua, they're a glowing exception to the trend. They are the bright spot, right? That there are people willing to fight and die for their country and for democracy. Okay, so that's what I want to keep in mind as we discuss, or as I talk about all the bad things that have happened. That's a really good thing, right, that we can take away from this right now. So, how did this begin? I think that Ambassador Ulibarri very clearly and coherently explained a lot of the antecedents to this. Kind of the proximate causes, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, on April 16th, President Daniel Ortega's Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, right, his Sandinista party government, made changes to the social security system. And you would think, so what? Well, it turns out that changing social security in any country, whether it's a democracy or a semi-dictatorship, is really, really difficult, right? And so this generated opposition from two really important private sector lobbies, right? The Consejo Superior de la Empresa Privada, the COSEP, and from the Chamber of Industry, the Cámara de Industria, the CADIN, among others, okay? As a part of that, thousands took to the streets in Managua, in the capital city, in León, in Estelí, in Masaya, in Granada, to protest. And it was the crackdown, right? That this was, first of all, one of the shows of unrest, the biggest shows of unrest to face the government since Ortega retook power more than a decade ago. Okay, he has an iron grip on institutions, and this was kind of unexpected. His reaction was a brutal crackdown, right? Excessive use of force by state security forces, press censorship, and then use of paramilitaries to go after protesters. And what this did was simply fan the flames of protest, and it encouraged more of the country to side with protesters and indeed to go out and try to defend or recover Nicaraguan democracy, right? So that response, kind of the response of the government and then the response of the protesters, appears to have exposed kind of some of the weaknesses of that government and its inability to recognize and allow any type of democratic pluralism in society, okay? Since that moment, The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has said that the government has killed 317 protesters. It has disappeared 600 of them, supposedly, and thousands have been hurt and hospitalized. The Nicaraguan Association for Human Rights, the ANPDH, says the number of protesters killed is at 448. Okay? So we're talking a major crisis in the country. All right? But how did it really begin? And I think that's the important thing that, kind of my comparative politics perspective. It's not just changes to the social security system, right? As Ambassador was saying, this has been a long time coming, right? There has been a slow erosion of democracy in Nicaragua since 2007. And if you go back even further, basically since Ortega and ex-President Arnoldo-Alemán pacted in 2000, okay, in the year 2000. Ortega is not a committed Democrat, and he never was, right? Ortega is a Democrat of convenience rather than one of vocation, right? We'll say. And what he did, well, this is what he's done since the year 2007. So he concentrated power of the executive branch with constitutional changes in 2007. He adopted a law criminalizing abortion under all circumstances, which was consistent with his party's platform, but created some dissension and opposition in society. In 2008, he centralized power in the government and harassed opposition parties during municipal elections. And this is going to be a pattern that he follows throughout the 10 years that follow, which is essentially getting rid of any coherent opposition. He takes strategies to divide the opposition, to allow it to run for elections, but under circumstances under which any opposition could, only extraordinarily win even anything approaching a plurality of seats in the legislature or at the municipal level. The international community condemned these 2008 elections. They're marred by allegations of vote rigging in favor of the FSLN, the governing FSLN. Foreign donors announced the suspension of $150 million in aid. Okay. 2009, Ortega secures a contentious Supreme Court ruling that strikes down the constitutional ban on consecutive terms, right? This is something that we've seen throughout Latin America. Ortega copies Evo Morales, who does this in Bolivia. He copies Hugo Chavez, who does this in Venezuela. He copies Rafael Correa, who does this in Ecuador. He copies presidents throughout the region who get rid of presidential term limits, right? Saying that a limit on his term is actually limiting the free will of the people to re-elect him to power, right? Journalists, government critics, civil society activists face continued harassment throughout 2009. 2010, Ortega issues a decree, right? A presidential decree allowing appointed officials, including members of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Electoral Council, to remain in their posts at the end of their terms, which is to say he's extending the same lack of limits on their power as he did to his own power the year before, allowing his cronies to stay in office and to consolidate power over those government institutions, okay? The decree preserves the 2009 ruling because what he was afraid of was the Supreme Court ruling against him running for consecutive terms, essentially reversing the decision that his cronyist Supreme Court ruled in favor of in 2009, okay? In September, they uphold the removal of the ban on consecutive presidential terms. 2011, Ortega wins re-election, but it's a controversial re-election in which there are claims, kind of credible claims of fraud, okay? There are transparency issues and other irregularities throughout the election. The Supreme Electoral Tribunal shows a clear lack of neutrality during this process. 2012, Ortega and the FSLN consolidate power. They win the November municipal elections overwhelmingly. The FSLN essentially takes over local government to a degree it had not been able to do in the past. There is increasing politicization of institutions as well, right? So minority voices essentially can't be heard. In 2014, the National Assembly, controlled, of course, by the Sandinistas, allows the Constitution, changes the Constitution to allow Ortega not just to run for an additional term, but lifts totally any limit on presidential re-election. In 2015, members of the opposition Independent Liberal Party march in downtown Managua. They call for free and fair elections. Police respond with tear gas and beat the detained demonstrators. Right? This is what we're seeing now is just the culmination of 10 years of repression in Nicaragua, right? I actually have 2 more pages of stuff going on in 2016 and 2017. I guess the point is, the protests seem to have come out of nowhere, right? But they didn't really. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of 10 years of Nicaraguans being beaten down and oppressed by this government, right? And so something as innocuous as Social Security reform is not just that. It's symbolic. It's the government unilaterally making a decision that people are opposed to, right? It's the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's important because it demonstrates everything that the country is up against, right? You have the elections, these past elections in which Ortega essentially has the Supreme Court disallow, and the Supreme Electoral Tribunal disallow the primary opposition candidate, Eduardo Montealegre, from running for office, right? So if you bar the opposition candidate, you were going to win re-election, okay? So that's what this movement is up against. How did Ortega get away with all this for 10 years? How did he get away with it? And I think that that's an important component to understand his sources of support. And it's not that he controlled everything and ruled through the military. No. His party retained significant support among Nicaraguans for a number of reasons. One, economic growth increased in Nicaragua, right, to a degree that it hadn't in the past. Two, government-backed programs helped reduce poverty very seriously, right? Nicaragua is noticeably less crime-ridden. For those of you who live or have traveled in Nicaragua and know Nicaragua, it's less crime-ridden than its northern neighbors, right? Than El Salvador, than Honduras, than Guatemala. Nicaragua's 2017 homicide rate, well, this will increase now this year, but his 2017 homicide rate was 7 killings per 100,000 people, right? That's the lowest in Central America, lower even than Costa Rica, right? This Switzerland of the Caribbean, right? Nicaragua had lower homicide rate. El Salvador's murder rate was 60 per 100,000, and Honduras's was 43 per 100,000. Okay, so significantly higher. It's a product of decades of experimental policies, of community policing, of women's empowerment, all these sorts of things, right? And really the Sandinista government getting rid of the oppressive Guardia Nacional, right, from the Somoza regime, okay? Ortega also forged alliances with a very important business community in Nicaragua, right? And he moderated to a certain degree his criticism of the United States. Essentially, he gets away because he has political sycophants on one side and private sector enablers, right? This is, he has an alliance. Nicaraguan history is just a series of alliances, by the way, right? Outside of formal political parties, it's whoever is governing forms alliances with other major groups. And we see this from essentially the 1930s to the present. But this is an alliance that he makes between the government and the COSEP, the country's Council of Business Chambers, all right? And that allows him to essentially violate all sorts of other things. Overhauling the Social Security tax system without consulting business leaders was the final straw for them as well, not just for ordinary Nicas, okay? So Ortega, who comes to power as this freedom fighter against the Somoza, this horrible Somoza dictatorship, has become Somoza, right? That's our other comparison. He concentrates a large amount of public and private resources in the hands of his family and close associates, right? We think Roberto Rivas is one very important kind of associated member who accumulated a large degree of wealth. He controls state apparatuses like Somoza, right? Including the army, the police, and supposedly independent agencies such as the electoral machinery and the courts. And 3, he uses repression and force like Somoza, more sporadically, but he uses it. This changes on April 18th. On April 18th, when the protests start, Ortega goes full-on Somoza, okay? So what's happened? We know the deaths, we know the injuries, we know the missing and disappeared. The Ortega government, according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, is responsible for 98% of deaths. We have one consequence being 23,000 Nicaraguans seeking asylum in Costa Rica right now. The population of Costa Rica already, as the ambassador said, is 7% Nicaraguan. There are between 350 and 500,000 Nicaraguans living in Costa Rica, right? And so you're asking another small country to absorb an additional 23,000 asylum seekers, or possibly less, given that some of those people in Costa Rica might be seeking asylum, as you suggested, right? You have millions of dollars lost. Our friend here at the end of the table, Brad, owns a restaurant in León. Well, owned a restaurant in León. We'll see what happened, right? The tourism industry has been wrecked. 80% of hotels and 35% of restaurants have closed. 120,000 people have lost their jobs. Total losses in the tourism industry stand at $230 million, right? All damaging consequences. The Nicaraguan Association for Human Rights has closed its office. There's been mistrust, government repression, social and political polarization. And all of these things augur very poorly for Nicaragua's future, no matter if Ortega leaves today, tomorrow, or in 10 years. The changes that he has wrought on society in his reaction to the protests are putting Nicaragua on a path not dissimilar to those of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The response of the government is similar to responses of those dictatorships in the 1980s and early 1990s. And that is changing society in a not good way, right? That level of polarization, distrust, and mistrust. So how does this compare to Venezuela? Well, there are at least 4 similarities, right? The first of these is that Ortega uses paramilitaries in order to suppress protesters. Paramilitaries are people, they can be young people, they can be old people, aligned with the government, who I'm sure that Victor will be able to describe them in horrifying detail in a little bit, but who have arms and even uniforms and are paid for by the government, right? Not formally, but the government, I know at least in a couple of instances, sends money to bank accounts, and then people belonging to those paramilitary groups are able to take that money out of the banks, right? So it's essentially kind of an indirect type of transfer from paramilitaries, from the government to the paramilitaries, right? So the government is financing paramilitaries. The paramilitaries then are the shock troops going in, trying to dissemble roadblocks, trying to killing people, kidnapping people, and violating human rights, okay? So in some sense, the government has one iota of plausible deniability to say, hey, it's not the army, it's not the police, it's these, we don't know who these people are, right? Even though they very clearly know who they are, and they are giving the financial resources to these paramilitaries in order to operate. That's a lot like Venezuela, right? Where we see colectivos in Caracas and in large cities that are essentially financed by the government, that have access to semi-automatic weapons as a result of this, and even in some cases government training. They were trained by Cubans in Venezuela, and who also repress protesters, especially in 2014 and 2017 were the 2 big events in Venezuela. 2, Ortega retains the loyalty of the armed forces, just like Nicolás Maduro. You say, how in the world can this government continue to exist given the level of unrest in the country and the economic problems that the country is facing? Well, very clearly, if you have the support of the army, those people who have the guns are the ones who are able to call the shots. And so as long as Ortega is able to kind of retain that loyalty, the way that Maduro has in Venezuela, it seems likely that he will continue in office. 3, Ortega has shown a willingness, just like Nicolás Maduro, to do anything and everything to remain in power, right? Whether or not the exit costs for him are too high, or he is just so addicted to power, he does not want to step down. And that means he's willing to kill his own population, innocent people, babies, children, right? in order to remain in power, just like Venezuela. And lastly, and very tragically, Nicaragua's opposition is weak, fragmented, and unprepared to govern, just like Venezuela's. And I say this with all due respect to the protest movement. But the protest movement, like the protest movements in Venezuela, need to not only protest the leader of their country committing atrocities, but come up with a plausible plan to govern the day after, right? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer. What are the differences? Well, two important differences that probably bode well for Nicaragua. Ortega doesn't enjoy oil windfalls the way that Maduro does in Venezuela, right? Although maybe Venezuela doesn't either right now, as we're seeing. But Nicaragua definitely doesn't, okay? And so his economic power is much less. Secondly, things are moving at a much faster rate in Nicaragua than they did in Venezuela, right? I don't mean the long, slow erosion of democracy and undermining of rights of Nicaraguans. What I mean is the protests occurred April 18th. The OAS has already condemned the actions in a vote, 21-3 vote, right? They have formed a special committee to investigate abuses there. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights has already issued reports. The U.S. Treasury Department has already sanctioned 3 Nicaraguan officials, right? These are all actions that have been taken, actions that have been taken since April 18th. That's quite remarkable, right, in terms of the international community reacting rapidly. I know separately, it's in my notes over there, but Luxembourg, I believe, and another European country have also withheld donations to Nicaragua as a result of the human rights abuses, okay? So that's really good, and maybe that means that there is some momentum for change in the country. What does the future tell us? I agree with your scenarios, Ambassador. I think that those are all possibilities. The Nicaraguan opposition has to learn from Venezuela. It has to learn from the fragmented opposition in Bolivia. It has to learn from the fragmented opposition in Ecuador. It has to learn, right, from all of these other instances of personalistic, authoritarian leaders trying to take control of state institutions and the failures of those oppositions to confront the leaders, right? Oftentimes they're heterogeneous, the way that the Alianza Cívica is a heterogeneous coalition, and as a result, there is very little holding together besides kind of the hatred, right? It's a very strong word, but the hatred for that political leader, okay? If the international community is able to continue exercising pressure on Nicaragua, it's hard to imagine that Ortega will be able to maintain his hold on power. That's my optimistic take. Because he doesn't enjoy those unlimited oil resources that Maduro does, right? Or even the control devices of the Cuban regime. We don't talk about Cuba in these cases, but you know, you don't want Nicaragua to be Cuba either. And the opposition must stay united. That's the most important thing. Stay united, as it did in 1990, allowing that transition to civilian government, and a plan for the day after, right? It needs to develop a plan for what happens. Ortega's gone tomorrow. What does the opposition do, right? You don't want a series of small groups with leaders, essentially caudillos, competing for power the way that we see in Venezuela. There needs to be a leader. Everyone needs to be step into line behind that leader with a kind of a common plan for governance. Again, you know, if there's any bright spot for Nicaragua, I think it's the students who are fighting. Their bravery, solidarity, and leadership in the push for justice and democracy is inspiring. I think that with international pressure, especially, I agree, economic pressure, and diplomatic pressure on members of the Sandinista government, and with continued nationwide protests, it could lead Ortega back to the negotiating table that he has stepped away from, right after retaking Masaya, I believe, the past week or so. I hope that there'll be change soon, positive change in the country, but it will take the international community plus protesters plus important politicians to step forward and fill the vacuum left by that weak and divided political opposition. Thank you.
Listo, sí.
No.
Hola, buenas tardes.
No, entonces, sí.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Seguramente no van a querer escucharme hablando inglés. Mi pronunciación es muy mala.
I'm sure none of you want to hear me speaking English. My pronunciation is terrible.
Sería un serio problema.
It'd be a big problem.
Muchas gracias a ustedes por estar acá,
Thanks so much to all of you for being here
al Instituto Hudson,
and the Hudson Institute.
a Jaime, Eduardo, Josh. Quiero agradecer a Eduardo, a John, a Jaime, porque son muy pocas las personas que no son nicaragüenses y conocen tan bien lo que está pasando en mi país.
I'd like to thank these three gentlemen because there are very few people that are not Nicaraguan that are aware of what's going on in my country,
Y que pueden hacer lecturas tan precisas.
and fewer that can do such precise assessments of what's going on.
Ya me ahorraron el trabajo de hacer un análisis de escenarios y de posibles soluciones.
They saved me the work of doing a big analysis of the situation,
Así que gracias.
so thank you.
La dictadura de los Ortega Murillo se consolidó a través de dos pactos.
The current dictatorship of Ortega Murillo was founded upon two deals or pacts.
En 1998, Arnoldo Alemán vendió la pluralidad partidaria
In 1998, Arnoldo Alemán sold the party plurality,
la autonomía de los partidos políticos y la institucionalidad de la Asamblea Nacional.
and the autonomy of the political parties, as well as the institutionality of the National Assembly.
Eso a cambio de su libertad.
He agreed to give all of that in exchange for his freedom.
Luego los empresarios estuvieron dispuestos a negociar la democracia y el Estado de Derecho de todo el país para obtener facilidades políticas que aseguraran la bonanza económica de los grandes capitales.
Big businessmen in the other deal were willing to negotiate democracy and the right to govern in order to exchange for political favors and the guarantee of a good economy.
Negociar con la democracia resulta atrayente para los empresarios. Podemos dejar al pueblo sin democracia y obtener dinero por ello.
So essentially what was happening with the big business, they were exchanging democracy and leaving the people kind of hanging them out to dry in exchange for good business.
A partir de 1998, el Frente Sandinista inició un proceso sistemático de consolidación de poder. Fueron pacientes y sigilosos. Aprendieron a amarrar los hilos correctos y construyeron el escenario perfecto para las elecciones en el año 2006.
So in lieu of those agreements in 1998, the Frente Sandinista party started to consolidate their power. They were very patient and secretive in doing so. They learned how to pull the right strings and created the ideal scenario for the 2006 elections, making Ortega's victory imminent.
En esas condiciones, la victoria de Ortega era inminente. Después del triunfo, los oligarcas comenzaron a trabajar de la mano con Ortega para disfrazar la macroeconomía. Los nicaragüenses de base continuábamos sumidos en la marginalidad y la subescolaridad, mientras los ricos consolidaban sus fortunas, los altos mandos del Ejército Nacional creaban sus propias empresas y todos los demás sectores de poder vendían sus almas por favores políticos.
After Ortega's triumph, the oligarchs began working in hand with the private sector and leaving the marginalized without good education. Meanwhile, the rich consolidated their fortunes, and the higher command of the national army were creating their own businesses, and everyone was selling their souls for political favors.
El 19 de abril todo cambió y por primera vez mi generación opuso resistencia a los atropellos del régimen.
On April 19th of this year, everything changed. For the first time, my generation started to resist the authorities of the regime.
La juventud universitaria se tomó las calles, las plazas, las rotondas y las universidades.
The youth and university students began to take the streets, the plazas, the political or the traffic circles, and the universities in protest.
Salimos con ferocidad y valentía, nos costó la vida de cientos de hermanos estudiantes y la libertad de quienes dimos batalla desde los primeros días de lucha. Entendimos, entre balas y gases lacrimógenos, que Nicaragua debía ser reconstruida. Nos dimos cuenta, entre el dolor de la muerte y el olor a sangre, que esta era la oportunidad de oro para desbaratar el statu quo y el entramado de corrupción en el que se sustenta.
We took to the streets with ferocity and bravery. It cost the lives of hundreds of university students and youth. And the freedom that we decided to fight for was a high cost from the first day. We understood that between the bullets and the tear gas, that Nicaragua had to be rebuilt. We realized that in between pain and death and the smell of blood, that this was our golden opportunity to break the status quo and end the corruption that held it up.
En Nicaragua no existía verdadera oposición política desde la disolución de la Unión Nacional Opositora 1. Los partidos políticos actuales funcionan como organizaciones parásitas que se alimentan de los recursos del Estado y sirven de distractores de opinión. Ahora,
in Nicaragua, there's no true political opposition to the regime ever since the dissolving of the National Opposition Union. The current political parties act as parasitical organizations that feed themselves on the resources of the state, and they just serve as distractions, political distractions from what's really going on.
Por primera vez, los estudiantes, los campesinos y los trabajadores nos hemos levantado para ejercer democracia desde las calles, desde incipientes espacios de articulación que nos permiten generar planteamientos políticos que estructurarán los cimientos de la nueva Nicaragua.
For the first time ever, university students, farmers, blue-collar workers have all come together to demand democracy from the streets, from every place in the country, articulating that they want new ideas politically that will form the new structure of what's going to be the new Nicaragua.
Lo que sucede en Nicaragua desde hace 113 días no obedece a polos políticos de derecha o izquierda. Se trata de un levantamiento orgánico de grupos oprimidos. La revolución cívica proviene de la fuerza popular, de las masas que fueron relegadas en la toma de decisiones políticas y limitadas al trabajo precario e informal.
What's been happening in Nicaragua for the past 113 days does not follow political lines of right and left, but rather it's a organic uprising from all of the oppressed groups. The civic revolution comes from the public force, from all of the masses who were relegated to the margins when it came to taking political decisions, and were limited to basic forms of work and just inequality.
Nos hemos unificado para crear un proyecto de nación que busca tres objetivos principales.
So we have organized into a wide front looking for three principles, political principles.
Primero, construir un sistema democrático e inclusivo donde todos cuenten y sean respetados.
First is to construct a democratic system that's inclusive, where everyone matters and is respected.
Segundo, la reinstauración del Estado de Derecho. Cada poder del Estado debe ser independiente y apartidista. La voluntad del pueblo deberá dictaminar cualquier decisión estatal.
Secondly is the reinstallation of the state of law. Each power of the state should be independent and neutral. The will of the people should be what dictates every decision.
Y tercero, la justicia debe ser verdadera e imparcial a todos los niveles. Nuestro sistema jurídico debe apegarse de forma irrestricta a las leyes, no a la voluntad del Ejecutivo.
Third is true and impartial justice on all levels. Our system, our justice system should be formed from strict following of the law, not whatever the judge in power determines to be true.
La continuidad de la dictadura es una brutal amenaza para el continente americano. La continuidad de la dictadura es una brutal amenaza para el continente americano.
So the continuation of this dictatorship is a huge threat on Nicaragua.
El sostenimiento del régimen en Nicaragua crearía en nuestra región un triángulo demoníaco.
The continuation of this dictatorship will create a demonic triangle of power.
Pobreza, muerte e inmigración.
Poverty, death, and immigration.
Hemos visto durante décadas el éxodo de los cubanos.
We've seen throughout the decades the exodus of Cubans.
Desde hace 2 años aumentó la inmigración venezolana.
Beginning 2 years ago, Venezuelan immigration has skyrocketed.
Y ahora, desde abril, se han registrado más de 23,000 nicaragüenses inmigrando a Costa Rica.
And since April, more than 23,000 Nicaraguans have immigrated to Costa Rica.
Si Ortega continúa en el poder,
If Ortega remains in power,
3 cosas nos esperan:
3 things await us:
inmigración masiva,
massive immigration,
narcotráfico y crimen organizado,
organized crime and drug trafficking,
y posibles vínculos con Rusia e Irán.
and connections with Russia and Iran.
Ortega es el verdadero caos.
Ortega is chaos.
Gracias.
Thank you.
We still have a few minutes, so we will take questions from all of you. We'll begin on the left.
Hello, my name is Christopher Schubert from the Mexican Mission to the Organization of American States. Thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I was wondering, I didn't hear any mention to the role that the UN could eventually play in this crisis, and it has been said that the Secretary General Guterres has been a little silent on this matter. So if you could please tell something about this, on your opinion on what the role of the UN could be, considering the rejection of the Nicaragua government to the actions that the OAS has been moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, I might refer to that because I have been in the UN for some years. Well, first of all, I think that was an omission. I think that the UN could have a major role to play according to the circumstances. let's keep in mind that so far the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has denounced the situation in Nicaragua. Also, Secretary General Guterres has criticized, not in a very forceful way, but he has criticized the use of repression in Nicaragua. And I think that this working group that was established by the OAS in August 2nd opens a way, one of many possible ways, for the incorporation of the UN in looking for a solution. As you said, Ortega has rejected any major role for the OAS. He has classified the OAS as an instrument of the US and imperialism and people who want a coup d'etat and injerencismo in the Nicaraguan society. So the United Nations could be a way out if he agrees to some sort of negotiated settlement in Nicaragua for opening an international door for supervision and for accompaniment of that possibility. You might keep in mind that during the 80s, when the Central American crisis was at its peak, both the UN and the OAS played a major role, along with Central American countries and some Latin American countries. So some sort of resemblance of that could be established. But of course, I think it depends a lot on what the attitude of Ortega may be. For the UN, taking a very strong position is difficult because, as you know, the balance of forces there is very, very different from the one in the OAS. The non-aligned movement is very important, and of course, the autocratic regimes that have a presence in the UN, and reflect the world, are many. So it's not a very clear possibility, but I think it could play a positive role in the future.
Embajador Javier.
Thank you. I'm Javier Rupert, the former Spanish ambassador here. As practically all of you have pointed out, Daniel Ortega doesn't seem to be ready to abandon power. And unfortunately, what happens to all dictators. Do you think, do you see any possibility, any realistic possibility of Ortega considering some of the options that you, Ambassador, pointed out in terms of negotiating his change of attitude? Or do you think it's at the end of the day there is nothing but exile or death for the dictator? Thank you.
You or Victor?
Sí, me vas a ayudar. Sí. Es así. Cuando fuimos avanzando en el proceso de protestas,
when we were moving forward with the protests,
entendimos que no todo lo íbamos a conseguir desde la calle.
we understood that we weren't going to achieve everything from the streets.
Y eso nos trajo por primera vez hace 2 meses a Washington.
So for the first time, 2 months ago, that brought us to Washington, D.C.
Y de esa visita conseguimos 3 sanciones Magnitsky más.
With that visit, we were able to get 3 officials sanctioned.
Y nos convertimos así en el primer país con mayor cantidad de sanciones.
We became the country with the most sanctions.
Pero esto tuvo una repercusión directa en el régimen.
So this had direct consequences on the regime.
Y hay una ley que se llama NICA Act.
There's a law called the NICA Act.
Que tiene casi 2 años de estar esperando que el Senado la apruebe.
Which has been waiting about 2 years to be approved by the Senate.
Esta ley es sumamente importante porque castiga los actos de corrupción.
This law is very important because it punishes the acts of violence
y la violación de derechos humanos.
and the violation of human rights.
Es ridículo pensar
It's ridiculous to think
que Estados Unidos siga enviando dinero a Nicaragua
that the United States should continue to send money to Nicaragua
como cooperación binacional,
as a bilateral cooperation,
mientras el Estado, la dictadura,
while the dictatorship
sigue matando a su
continues
pueblo.
killing their own people.
La Embajada de los Estados Unidos en Nicaragua
The U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua
constató que vehículos, herramientas que se habían donado a la Policía Nacional
allowed for vehicles and resources that had been donated to the National Police
estaban siendo usados para secuestrar, torturar y matar nicaragüenses.
be used to assassinate, kill, and hunt Nicaraguans.
Entonces, NICA Act pone un freno rotundo
So the NICA Act puts the brakes on
a toda relación económica que este país pueda tener con Nicaragua,
on all of the economic support from the United States,
siempre y cuando continúa habiendo violación a los derechos humanos y a la democracia.
always as long as violence continues.
Esa es la única forma de hacer que Ortega se siente a negociar.
This is the only way that Ortega will sit down and negotiate.
You
A
want
quick answer too.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think that's a great question. What happens to dictators when they how do they leave office? I mean, they're exiled or they die, right, or they're killed. And I think that what Ortega has done is he's created an enormous game of chicken in which he's raised those exit costs by repressing and people. And so after killing your own population, what happens? You either become a harder line dictator, one, you end up going into exile because of any number of other factors, or you're killed by your own state security forces, right? So those seem to be the likely landing spots for him, in my opinion. Thanks.
Any questions on the right? Yes, sir.
Very interesting, and I would particularly appreciate the presence of somebody who is trying to do the right thing for his country. And I do believe that the U.S. has to play a key role in this, and I do believe that the economic leverage is very important. And I think your remarks, I call on my country to step in, not with an invasion, but I would like to see the exposure of the corruption of the Ortega regime. And where is his money? Where are his bank accounts? What crimes is he committing? Financial crimes that not just in his country, but he's breaking international laws. And I think that this type of political pressure can almost force the U.S. to take further steps, because you're right. He's either going to have to leave, and I don't know where he'll leave, but he's probably thinking about this. He probably has money stashed away, or he's going to have to be overthrown. I don't know if you can comment on this. Thank you.
Usted es el especialista en eso.
Well, no, I think you're right. Of course, totally right. Well, I think the economy of Nicaragua is stronger at the same time weaker than the one of Venezuela. They don't have this natural resource that is oil, but they have never, the state have not taken control of the economy. It has been managed from the macroeconomic point of view in a responsible way, second. And thirdly, it's more diversified than the economy of Venezuela. At the same time, it depends on foreign trade for its subsistence. It's a very small economy, and as all small economies, depend a lot foreign trade. And it depends a lot on financial inflows from lending organizations such as the Inter-American Development Bank and others, and also of bilateral cooperation. And of course, many members of the Nicaraguan political and Sandinista elite have accounts and use the international financial system for their benefit. So I think that the US could put a lot of pressure, and the NICA Act especially establishes that the US should oppose any financing of Nicaragua by lending institutions while there is no real democracy in the country and repression continues growing. It has at least 3 years. It's 3 or 4 years old. It was approved by the House of Representatives in 2017, but it's pending in the Senate. So that could be a good step forward. And also using the financial system, you know, all the plumbing of the international financial system comes through the US, so you could use that as a leverage, especially against particular members of the Nicaraguan regime.
That being said, I'll just add my cynical take, which is that, well, I think there's a lot the US can do. I'm not sure that there is a political will to do those things. It took a lot for the United States to act against Venezuela, and that has a lot, in my opinion, to do with the significant Venezuelan population in especially South Florida. And so domestic political pressures have influenced an international decision. And there is not a significant Nicaraguan population in the United States. And so it's going to be up to people like Victor and other leaders, student leaders and otherwise, to come to Washington and to put pressure on the government to act, as you say. Thanks.
One comment. I just had a meeting last week at the Heritage Foundation. I am nobody. I know nothing about politics. I just live in Nicaragua, and I became friends with Victor during the protests. But in my meeting at the Heritage Foundation, became aware, and you'll have to correct me on the banks, but there's U.S. tax money still being sent to Nicaragua, so that's something that I think we should definitely work on through USAID, the World Bank, I believe, and another bank, IDB maybe, or something like that.
IDB.
So this should not be happening, so that's just something that came to our attention during the meeting I had last week. But.
Yes, sir.
The United States has a history of supporting the so-called...
Would you give us your name on
Yeah, sure. I'm Ken Meyercord. I produce a TV show called Civil Discord. The United States has a history of supporting the so-called color revolutions around the world. 90% of Nicaragua's imports of arms and munitions comes from Russia. Last year, Russia opened a satellite tracking station in Nicaragua. This year, on May 8th, they signed a memorandum with Nicaragua, which caused a Spanish newspaper to ask, will Nicaragua become Russia's Cuba of the 21st century? Could there be a connection between these developments and the unrest in Nicaragua?
I think that I'm the person who's tasked with answering this question. Yeah. I don't believe so. I don't believe so. The grievances of Nicaraguans are not, by all indications, are not influenced by that. More so, I would say, China than Russia, right? Especially China's proposed interoceanic canal. That was a cause of other smaller, but still protests over the past 2 years. So that more than Russia seemed China seems to play a larger role. Maybe Victor can speak to that.
Sí puede convertirse en la Cuba de este siglo.
Yes, I think it could turn itself into the Cuba of this century.
Pero para que eso no suceda, creo que este país tiene un papel muy importante.
But this country has a big role to play in that not happening.
La economía de Nicaragua se sustenta en las relaciones comerciales que tiene con Estados Unidos.
The Nicaraguan economy is highly dependent on the relationship it has with the United States.
Este país es el socio comercial más importante y quien sostiene con ayuda económica, con empleos, Nicaragua.
This country and its economy is what maintains Nicaragua's economy.
Rusia no va a poder sostener a esa dictadura, no le interesa estar pasando un cheque mensual para hacerlo.
Russia is not interested in sending checks, monthly checks to Nicaragua to keep their economy afloat.
Pero si la política exterior de este país
But if the external policies of this country
considera que sigue siendo más importante mantener las relaciones comerciales por estabilidad, si la política exterior de este país considera que es mejor mantener relaciones comerciales con Nicaragua para mantener estabilidad,
so if they decide that the external policies are necessary to maintain economic stability,
entonces Daniel Ortega va a estar en el poder por muchísimo tiempo.
Ortega will stay in power as long as he can.
He's 72, though.
Ustedes tienen que entender
You need to understand
que Ortega ha logrado por 12 años acaparar todos los espacios de poder.
Ortega, through the years, has been able to consolidate all of the sectors of power.
Porque duerme todos los días abrazado del empresariado.
Because he sleeps every day hugging the private sector.
Y justamente ese empresariado vive de los negocios que tiene con Estados Unidos.
And the private sector businesses live on the relationships they have with the United States.
Si este gobierno le da la espalda a Daniel Ortega,
If our government here in the States turns its back to Daniel Ortega,
rotundamente los empresarios van a tomar el lado del pueblo, lo que el pueblo está exigiendo.
then the private sector will take the side of the people of the country.
Rotundly so.
Rotundly so. Yeah. And I did actually also have a meeting with David Shedd. Do you know that name? He was the late director of intelligence under Obama years ago. He's retired CIA, and he was telling me that he 100% believes that Cuba is behind what's going on in Nicaragua right now with their intelligence, and they're backed by Russia. So his professional opinion was that Cuba is very much involved on the ground in Nicaragua.
Una última pregunta, one last question. In that case, I thank you very much for having been here with us this afternoon. And I believe that our extremely wonderful panel, brilliant, deserves a final round of applause. Please.
Okay.